First, I'd like to thank the organizers for having me. It's a pleasure to celebrate Bielefeld's 50th anniversary, a birthday that I share this year as well. So I toast Bielefeld to 50 more, at least. So my talk actually follows from Stefan Lesonich's in a sense that I will be talking about global social theory. I agree that methodological nationalism still persists. In fact, I think it's a perennial and deeply problematic issue. This persistence of methodological nationalism, much of social theory, I would contend, too often assumes that society, social relations, and nation states overlap. And this is a problem. I also agree that there are critiques of methodological nationalism and that there have been alternative theoretical traditions, different ways of perceiving the whole, as Wallerstein says in that quote that Stefan Lesonich has. In fact, there are more than enough critiques, I would say, or there's multiple approaches to theorizing the global. One, of course, is the world systems theory from Wallerstein that we just heard about. This was exactly an attempt to rescale social theory, to try to account for global social relations. And Wallerstein, of course, did that working within the Marxist tradition to conceive of the world system as a single economic system, a single capitalist system. There's also been what's called sometimes world society or neo-institutional theory. This comes from John Mayer and his colleagues at Stanford University. They argue that we have to think of society as being global. There's a singular global society. It's a single world society. It provides these dominant cultural scripts that all nations follow. So the very idea of a nation state comes from a global culture which thinks about the world in terms of nation states and individuals and so on. There's also, appropriately, what I would think of as the Bielefeld school of global social theory. This includes, for example, Niklas Luhmann's work on globalization. Some of you may know, while Luhmann's systems theory was initially meant to understand processes within the nation state, he also theorized globalization and sought to conceptualize global society as a singular system of differentiation. I would also mention here, out of my own interest, actually, Norbert Elias, who was here at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research from 1978 to 1984. Elias famously theorized the civilizing process in Europe, and of course his theoretical work is completely distinct from the Luhmann tradition, but he did offer some ideas for considering not just relations between individuals, but also relations between states in the international system. And so in a sense, he did offer some ways, some concepts for thinking about a more global system. And in fact, some scholars in international relations have just recently, in the past few years, tried to use some of Elias's concepts to think about the international system. The Bielefeld school would also include, of course, Bettina Heinz and Rudolf Stiegler and Matthias Albert and Tobias Werron, all of whom are, in their different ways, trying to think about global social relations or global international relations. So my goal today is to humbly contribute to this Bielefeld tradition, not the tradition of Luhmann per se. I'm not going to focus on Luhmann or Elias, but rather the tradition of theorizing and of trying to think about the global in a very serious way. That's what I see as an important Bielefeld tradition, and that's the tradition I want to contribute to today, however, in my own way. Specifically, I want to make two moves. First, in the beginning of my talk, I want to think a little bit about the process of theorizing itself, which is something that Sina Farzin and Tobias Werron have also invited us to do in some of their other work. And that is, how do we theorize at all? What is the process of theorizing? And particularly, how do we theorize on a global scale? And I want to then discuss what I see as the dominant, if not the only mode in which the global has been theorized to date. And I want to suggest that this is globalizing the provincial, or globalizing the local, essentially rescaling from the national, and I'll explain that. This analysis of this mode of theorizing will enable us to see how certain theories of the global have been in fact generated in the first place, and will also help us think harder about alternative, new theories of the global. That then is the second part of my talk. I want to talk about some of those possible alternative theories of the global. And ultimately, my argument will be that most dominant social theories of the global have been modeled upon particular metropolitan or Anglo-European social sites. The provincial site from which existing theories globalize to generate their theories of the global has been the modern European West. An alternative tradition of thought I want to suggest offers different sites for consideration, different bases for theorizing the global. That alternative tradition, I will argue, lies in anti-colonial or post-colonial thought, which points to sites of racialized domination, both within metropoles and particularly in the colonies. And these sites, I want to argue, can also be places from which to theorize global relations. And for this, I will refer to W.E.B. Du Bois and then Pierre Bourdieu. I want to argue both of them are very similar in that they both actually theorize from the colonial site. First, this first part about the mode of theorizing, or globalizing from the particular. What do I mean here? Well, here I mean to simply point out that all social theories come from a place. They are typically modeled upon some implicit or explicit reference point, or as Monica Krauss might call it, some model system upon which the theory is based. For example, social evolutionary thought in the late 19th century was, of course, about modeling social relations after biological systems. So biological systems was the model system from which to generate theories about the social system. To take another example, in the post-World War II period, modernization theory emerged. And modernization theory was basically about idealizing a version of American or European development, abstracting from it to create a theoretical set of theoretical propositions that then were applied to other countries around the world, thereby universalizing the particular experience of an idealized European experience to other parts of the world. Or even take Karl Marx's theory of capitalism. In Das Kapital, the entire theory, I would argue, is based upon Marx's understanding of a particular relation, the particular wage relation between the white English capitalist and the white wage worker in the English industrial factory. The entire theory, I would argue, is predicated upon modeling that relation. So my claim is that the same thing occurs with our existing theories of the global. Many, if not all, can be thought of as spatially rescaled extensions or generalizations of a particular local, provincial, or national site. They look at experiences or relations in one country or one social location and then scale it upwards to theorize global relations. And most often these theories are modeled after Anglo-European experiences, the modern West. This is, of course, the case, I would argue, for Marxist theories of the capitalist world system in the tradition of Wallerstein. I think we could maybe debate this a little bit, but it seems to me that the basis of Wallerstein's systems theory is that the entire world can be divided into at least three main categories: the core, the periphery, and semi-periphery, and that this is simply modeled after the class structure of Western capitalist societies, with their prototypical division into proletariat, middle class, and capitalist classes. And Wallerstein's theory just extends that to the global scale. Or consider the Luhmannian approach to globalization. This approach really is thinking about world society as a matter of differentiation, and while I cannot be entirely sure about this, maybe Some of you Luhmann disciples can tell me if I'm correct or not. My bet is that in formulating this theory, Luhmann was implicitly, if not explicitly, referencing modern European society. It is a theory of modern European society, and modern society, of course, is then taken to the global scale in his theory. Or similarly, the other theory I mentioned, the new institutionalist approach to world society from John Mayer and the Stanford School, this, in fact, comes from developments in organizations theory. These organization studies, which were studies of organizations and their environments based upon how organizations in the United States operated, and particularly nonprofit organizations. And all Mayer did was then say, okay, this is how organizations in the US works, and this is then, we can scale that up to the global level and say this is how organizations in the world systems works. You just rescale the theory. The organizations he was talking about, of course, were the nation state. So this is what I mean. Globalizing social theory has, in a sense, meant universalizing the provincial or globalizing the national. And the provincial and national here has tended to be modern European Western societies and relations. Now, my point here is not to question this mode of theorizing. It's to make it explicit and therefore to be able to ponder this. How might our global theory look different if we started from different sites or different locations than modern social relations in the West? We can ask this about social theories more generally. I've often wondered, for example, if Marx's social theory, or how Marx's theory of capitalism would have looked different if his starting point or his model system was not the wage relation between the capitalist and the worker in an English industrial factory, but rather the relationship between a plantation slave owner in the Caribbean and the slave. His notion of capitalism would look a little bit different. Well, similarly, I'm asking how we might think along these lines for thinking about alternative theories of the global system or global relations. What if we modeled global social relations after local or national processes that none of the existing theories of the global use as their model system? What if, for example, we looked at relations of racialized domination as our model system? And this, I would argue, underlies the global theory of W.E.B. Du Bois. For those of you who don't know who W.E.B. Du Bois is, he's a prominent African-American intellectual writing in the early 20th century. He became a prominent political activist, but he was also one of the key founders of American sociology. And his main early contribution was to, unlike the Chicago School or other schools, was to critically theorize race relations in the United States. And he had a bunch of different concepts for thinking about race relations, including his prominent notion of the color line. His initial work started from talking about race relations in Philadelphia, and then some of his other essays thought about race relations in the American South. And it is from his understanding of these race relations that he theorizes the color line with his famous statement, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Du Bois was here saying that the key structuring relation in modern society for the 20th century is not economic class, primarily, but race relations. So Du Bois's early work started from this, but actually what I want to argue is a couple things. First of all, that he also generated a global social theory. And that theory, secondly, was in many ways an extension of a globalization of his understanding of localized race relations, not only race relations in the United States, but also in the modern colonial world. Now, to fully understand this, we have to recall the historical context in which Du Bois was writing. This was the period of the early 20th century, the period of the so-called new imperialism, or sometimes called a period of high imperialism, when European powers stepped up their imperial interventions overseas, acquired New colonies around the world constructed new colonial regimes of racialized domination and colonial governmentalities of rule. The United States, of course, was a key player in this new imperialism. By the end of the 19th century, the United States seized Hawaii. Then it fought Spain in 1898 to acquire the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, just to name a few. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, living in the United States, was alive to these global developments. And he began to theorize the race relations in the U.S. as but one instance of what he saw as a larger system of global domination being created by this new imperialism. In fact, Du Bois's famous concept of the color line was not meant to be restricted to race relations in the United States. Rather, Du Bois came to think of it as a global color line. And it was a global color line that was being generated and perpetuated precisely because of the new imperialism, precisely because of empires, the modern Western empires colonizing the world. Accordingly, in his 1906 essay, The Color Line Belts the World, he writes that imperialism is, quote, the most significant fact of the century. He then continues, the tendency of the great nations of the day is territorial, political, and economic expansion, but in every case that has brought them in contact with darker peoples, so that we have today England, France, Holland, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and the United States in close contact with brown and black peoples. The policy of expansion then simply means world problems of the color line. So Du Bois was theorizing the color line as a global system, right? So important to Du Bois was this global color line that he criticized his peers for failing to recognize the color line as a global problem, as a problem not just in the United States. And he, in fact, criticizes his fellow African Americans. Most Americans are simply tired and impatient over our most sinister social problem, the Negro. Of all possible altitudes, this is the most dangerous because it fails to realize the most significant fact of the opening century. The Negro problem in America is but a local phase of a world problem. For Du Bois, the color line encompassed nearly every part of the world. In the late 1930s, for instance, Du Bois writes a series of essays where he claims that the racism of Hitler's Germany is connected with and is part of the same racism in the British Empire and in America's empire. And he was among the first to point out that Nazi Germany drew from the theories of race from eugenicists in the United States. He likewise writes that British colonialism was similar to America's treatment of African Americans. And he made parallels among all kinds of different colonial situations, as well as between overseas and internal colonialism. British colonialism in India, Du Bois wrote, was similar to America's domination of freed slaves, which was in turn similar to America's domination of Hawaii, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, which was in turn similar to British colonialism, and so on and so on. Now, there's a lot more I could say about this global social theory. My point simply is twofold. First, Du Bois here is offering a nascent global social theory. The global system in Du Bois's theory is not primarily a system of world society of shared cultural scripts, as the Stanford School would have it, nor is it only an economic system, as Wallerstein's world systems theory would have it. Rather, the global society is a global hierarchy of racialized domination operating through European and American empires. In other words, what we find in Du Bois is the notion that the modern world has been structured fundamentally by a logic of empire and colonialism and their attendant racial and economic logics. A global social system which institutionalizes racial domination, generates and reproduces the color line along with racial ideologies, and which is manifested in multiple sites all around the world. We might today call this a global system of white supremacy. And in fact, Du Bois's theory of global racial hierarchy was used to explain a lot of things. For instance, Du Bois writes about the First World War, and he prefigures some of world systems theory's analyses of imperialism by theorizing the First World War as the result of white empires fighting with each other for what he calls black and yellow labor. They could no longer get away with exploiting white workers internally, so they had to extend outwards. They had to compete for raw materials and labor overseas. Again, this is a kind of nascent theory. Lenin had some of these ideas too, but Du Bois really articulates this and sees imperialism as both producing this global hierarchy and reproducing it. So you have a new imperialism and World War I, in fact, as the result of this global system of racialized domination. He does, in fact, just as a side point, connect this racialized global system to the capitalist world economy, thereby sharing some ground with Marxist world systems theory. But again, Du Bois theorizes it more explicitly as a system of global racial exploitation. In one famous passage from his book, Black Reconstruction, he writes, "That dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all Africa, and the West Indies and Central America and the United States, that great majority of mankind on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry, is despised and rejected by race and color, paid a wage below the level of a decent living, driven, beaten, prisoned, and enslaved in all but name, spawning the world's material and luxury," and so on and so on. And the resultant wealth is distributed and displayed and made the basis of world power. The emancipation of man is the emancipation of labor, and the emancipation of labor is the freeing of that basic majority of workers who are yellow, brown, and black. So this is a kind of global theory of the world system that's economic and racial. So that's my first point. This is a global social theory. The second key point, again, is to return to the origins of this global social theory. As I've mentioned, Du Bois began by looking first at black-white relations in the United States, primarily in Philadelphia and then in the American South. And then he turned his lens to colonialism in other countries. His theory of the color line, then, of the global color line, is similar to the other theories I've discussed, the other global theories. Du Bois simply extends his analysis of social relations in the US, but in particular race relations in the US, he extends them to a world scale. Right? The only difference with the other theories is that what he looks at in this national context is different. He's not looking primarily at class relations. He's not looking at differentiation in the United States. He's not looking at organizational theory, but rather he's looking at situations and systems of racialized domination in the American South and in other colonies. And Du Bois's theory of the global color line is a scaled-up version of the theory of the color line as it operates in these national spaces. It just focuses upon race relations. Now, let me turn to the second and the only other alternative global social theory that I want to think about here, and that is Pierre Bourdieu's field theory. Now, field theory, I would contend, and I have in some of my work, offers a distinct way of looking at global relations. Foremost, it invites us to think about global relations as primarily about fields, a global field, where fields are actors competing with or struggling over various forms of capital. For instance, Monica Krauss, in her work, suggests that we can think of the global humanitarian work as constituting a global humanitarian field. According to Krauss, international NGOs compete with each other for resources or economic capital, but they also compete with each other for status or what she calls humanitarian capital. That is, organizations are vying with each other to prove that they're the most humanitarian, which means that they're the most politically disinterested, and therefore they're the most humanitarian. We could also think about, say, the international diplomatic field, whereby diplomats compete with each other for respect and status in order to then transform that into political capital. Or the work of Larissa Boltschultz in Northwestern talks about a global art field in which artists on a global scale are competing with each other for status and capital. In my own work, I've used Bourdieu's field theory to reconceptualize the international system of states as one of a field of states who compete for various types of capital on the global scale, including not just economic capital, but also security capital and symbolic capital. Now, note how field theory as a global theory differs from some other approaches. It differs certainly from Du Bois's theory, for instance, because it does not focus primarily upon racial hierarchy. It can analytically absorb racial hierarchy, but that's not the theory's primary focus. It's a little bit more abstract. For Bourdieu, a global field would be any hierarchy which is based upon competing systems of capital valuation. In other words, a differential accumulation of capitals produces the hierarchy. Field theory is also different from neo-institutionalist theories of world society from the Stanford School. Rather than conceptualizing world society as a cohesive system of shared cultural scripts, field theory emphasizes struggle and conflict. And what constitutes a field in the first place, according to Bourdieu, is struggle over capital. If there's no struggle over capital, and again, there could be multiple forms of capital, it could be economic, cultural, and so on. If there's no struggle over capital, there's no field. The other important difference, and the final one I'll mention here, is field theory's relationality as opposed to substantialism. Substantialist theories posit durable and coherent substances that possess essential properties, whether those substances are things, people, or even systems. And many existing global theories are of this sort. They tend to theorize global space as a system with inherent logics or inherent essences, whether that be differentiation or economic exploitation. The relationalism field theory means that field theory jettisons talk of systems and essential interests and identities, and instead speaks of relations. There is no essential feature of fields or of the actors, rather the identity of the actors, of the capitals they value, and hence of the field itself is only constituted through the social relations at play. The capitals valued and interests involved in the global humanitarian field, for instance, will be different from those in the global field of states. And the actors can vary. They can be individuals or they can be states. And this is why field theory is particularly amenable, I would argue, to explaining how our international system was transformed from a field of empires to a field of nation-states. Not because of some inherent systemic logic of differentiation or capitalism, nor because of some essential scripts dictated by world society, but because of the contingent struggles in the field that generated new national identities. And I discussed this in some of my other work. In any case, my point is that field theory offers a different way of conceptualizing global relations from other theories. And my last point is that this theory was not modeled after social relations in Europe. Some of its roots, I will argue, lie in modeling colonial relations. Now, this may seem like a stretch. The common notion is that Bourdieu's field theory came first from his analysis of the religious field in France. But let us not forget that Bourdieu's formative work, for those of you who know Pierre Bourdieu, his formative work was in fact on what? Colonial Algeria. And it is from this site that he produced his earliest publications. And while his entire theoretical apparatus of fields was not produced from these Algerian studies, I would at least say that some dimensions of his field theory comes from his analysis of French colonialism in Algeria. In fact, throughout his discussion of colonialism in Algeria, Bourdieu implicitly theorized colonialism itself as a field, and he deployed relational thinking to apprehend it. The colonial system, or the colonial situation, as he said, is like a field in that it shapes actors and their actions. What determines the colonizer's practices and actions and the colonized practices and actions is not some essential feature within them, like race. Right? So the French racist ideology was that the colonized are inferior because of their intrinsic racial inferiority. Bourdieu argued, in fact, that this was relationally produced. It was produced from the colonial relation because of their relation of colonial subordination and domination. Bourdieu wrote about how the colonized act and react in relation to the colonizers, and how the colonizers act and react in relation to the colonized. Bourdieu thus argues that these racial stereotypes of Algerians and other colonized peoples do not refer to an intrinsic characteristic, but rather a relational position of subordination, that the identity and habits and practices of both the colonized and the colonizer is produced from this relation of subordination and domination. Colonialism, he says, creates the contemptible person, in this case the colonized Arab, at the same time that it creates the contemptuous attitude of the colonizing French. So the colonial system gives birth to and reproduces, in fact, the racialized identity and racism itself, he says. This, I would argue, is a statement of relationality exactly. Second, the colonial situation is like a field in that it is hierarchical. Colonialism, Bourdieu says, is a sort of caste system composed of two distinct communities with one dominating the other. And this prefigures Bourdieu's later claim about social fields. They all have dominant and subordinate positions. Third, colonial relations, according to Bourdieu, are like a field in the sense that it is replete with struggle and conflict. I'm sorry, that's hierarchical structure. And then it's a site of conflict and struggle. This emphasis on struggle and conflict is what differentiates his field approach from, I think, other theoretical approaches. And this is also part of Bourdieu's theory of the colonial situation. Bourdieu says that colonialism is always marked by conflict between the dominator and the subordinate, the colonizer and the colonized. And he argued with fellow French reformers of colonial Algeria, such as Germain Tillion, who argued that the problem in French Algeria, these social problems, these conflicts, are because of bad French policy, and that you need to reform French policy. Bourdieu said no amount of bad French policy is going to change the colonial situation. The only thing that's going to change the colonial situation is if you overcome colonialism entirely. That's because colonialism, according to Bourdieu, is built in with conflict. There is struggle and conflict that is characteristic of colonialism itself. So the only way to get rid of that struggle and conflict is to overcome colonialism entirely. This is exactly his definition of a field. A field is defined by relations of struggle and conflict. So this is why, for these reasons, I would argue that the real origins of Bourdieu's field theory lie not in France, but in French Algeria, in colonialism. And so, just to sum up a little bit here, my claim is that both Bourdieu's field theory and Du Bois' theory of the global, as marked by the color line, both of these theories are very similar in the sense that they are modeled after local sites of colonial domination. They take colonial relations of domination, whether in the US or in Algeria, and scale that upwards to think about the global color line or social fields, which then we scale upwards to think about global social fields. In this, they are different from pre-existing approaches to the global, which induce their theories of global relations from their analysis of local social relations in the modern European world. Modern European relations in modern Anglo-European world, which then I would argue is the model system for world systems theory, neo-institutional theory, and differentiation theory. I may be wrong about that, but we can talk about that. So all theories of the global universalize the local, or they start from nationally based sites. What's different is the relations in those sites that they look at, and how the Bourdieu-Du Boisian theory is based upon colonial relations in the colonies. So let me conclude just by simply reiterating that my point in sketching these alternative theories of the global is not to say that these alternative theories of Du Bois or Bourdieu are somehow superior to other approaches. My point is that they offer insights into certain global logics and dynamics and processes that the other theories might overlook. They look at global race relations, they look at competition for capitals, including cultural capital, not just economic capital, and so on and so on. And this, I think, helps us think harder about theorizing the global. When we want to theorize the global society, we should be conscious of the implicit model systems upon which we generate our global social theories. Are we modeling them implicitly upon European systems or some idealized version of relations in Europe or the United States? Are we modeling them after colonial relations or what? I think that if we're explicit about that, then we can also be explicit, more conscious of, reflect upon, and perhaps transcend the limitations of those theories. We can think harder about what those theories of the global might miss when they're based only upon certain experiences, such as experiences in the European world. We can think harder about what those theories might overlook or what they might cover up, intentionally or not. Thank you very much.